been paying attention to the news lately, besides all the crazy political stuff, there's been seemingly an uptick in volcanoes and earthquakes and things like that, especially in what they call the Pacific Rim. There's been many more occurrences of that type of behavior from the earth. Now, some people would say, oh, look, it's the end of the world. It's the end times. Look, Jesus said there are going to be earthquakes and wars and rumors of war. But really, when Jesus was talking about those signs, he was talking specifically about when God was going to destroy Jerusalem with the Roman army. So he was giving them these signs about earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars so that they would understand to leave Jerusalem so that they would not die from the hands of the Romans, to keep the church alive and growing and all that sort of stuff. So it's not about the end times, people. You can relax. But it doesn't make it any less terrifying, especially if you live in California, where they are just so worried about the big one striking and leveling the whole state, or if you live in Hawaii right now as they're dealing with that volcanic eruption, which they have no idea when it's going to stop, but it's not just the volcano, but it's spewing lava out different crevices long distance away from the actual volcano. So it's an actual terrifying experience. But from my point of view, I like science type stuff. I'm nerdy like that. And so earthquakes and volcanoes, they are interesting to me. The power that is involved with these things is absolutely phenomenal. This one plate scraping against another one can release so much energy that it can be felt for hundreds of miles away. To me, that is fascinating. It is awesome. It is cool. But it is, like I said, for those who are experiencing it, absolutely terrifying. But you need to have a good balance if you live in those places between being afraid and being fascinated. You don't want to be so afraid that you're paralyzed that you can't go about your daily life. You don't go to work because you're afraid the office building is going to collapse on you or the roads are going to fall out from under you for your driving. But at the same time, you can't be so lackadaisical about things that you don't build your house up to the codes that are required for that natural disaster. For us who lived, when we lived in Florida, they had hurricane building codes so the houses wouldn't blow away, which is futile to some extent. But in California, they have to build their houses so that, in their office buildings, so that if there is an earthquake, that they can sway and not fall down and all that sort of stuff. And if you live in Hawaii, you might not want to build a very expensive house because it can just burn up, at the blink of an eye. So maybe a tent would be more applicable in Hawaii. And I hear the temperature is fine for that anyway. So I digress. So you need to have this good balance between awe and terror if you live in one of these earthquake or volcano-prone areas. And the same balance needs to happen with us when we think of God. We ought to be absolutely terrified about who God is, but we also ought to be amazed in a good way. We ought to be full of joy and awe, but also of terror. We don't want to be so lackadaisical in our faith or so carefree in our faith that we forget that God is a God of wrath. But at the same time, because we live by grace, we live under the forgiveness of Christ, there is a lot that we don't have to fear anymore. We don't have to fear his wrath because we are forgiven. But we also don't want to say, well, I can go off and do whatever I want, because we need to have the balance between grace and God's wrath. But oftentimes, I think we become paralyzed in our fear of God. We think that maybe we'll do the wrong thing and God is going to strike us dead. That maybe I will forget to confess one of my sins and God is going to hold that against me. That every day I've got to rack my brain and remember every little thing that I've done so that when I go to God in prayer and I say, God, please forgive me, and I name off all the things, that I don't forget something or else God is going to strike me down. That's not grace. That's law. Or maybe we are debating on what is God's will for my life. Is it God's will for me to do this or that? How do I know what God's will is? What if I make the wrong choice and God punishes me for going down the wrong path? Well, if you're not going down the path of sin, God's grace and His will is rather large. There are lots of options that God gives it up to us to choose and decide. But again, you don't want to go off and do something absolutely crazy, like become a missionary in Africa or Haiti or something like that, or maybe you would. We need to have this balance between fear and love and awe and terror of God. And that's going to be shown to us in Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to be looking at verses 18 through 29. We talked about the first half of this passage last week. And the last things that he reminded us of is that we need to strengthen our faith. We need to strengthen the things that we lack so that we won't fall short of this race that we are running towards the finish line. Then he told us that to encourage one another and to make sure that we are working towards peace with one another, that we are holding each other accountable and encouraging one another so that nobody falls away from the faith, that we don't let bitterness just spring up and get its way in the body of Christ, or that we don't go off and fulfill all of our bodily appetites without self-control. And then he goes on and talks about this balance between terror and awe. And hopefully as we look at that, we will strike a balance, but I would actually suggest that maybe we ought to not have a balance, but we need to maybe edge away from the terror of God. You'll see that here in a minute. So we're going to have a healthy fear so that we can get rid of whatever unhealthy dread that we have, so that we can live a joy-filled life with Christ. And to do that, he's going to compare, we're going to go on a little road trip. We're going to stop by two mountains along the way, and there's a difference in our reaction at these two mountains. The first one is in 18. He says, "You have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire, and darkness and gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and a voice whose words make the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, 'I tremble with fear.'" Now you notice that he's beginning the section with the word "for." He's building on the reasoning that he gave in the last little bit about making sure that we endure, that we help each other out, that we stay faithful to God, and we walk in faith in this life. In light of that, he says, "You have not come to Mount Sinai." This imagery that he is using here is coming from the Old Testament when the people of God, as they are being led out of Egypt, God brings them to this mountain, Mount Sinai. And this is where God came down and spoke with Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments and gave them the rest of the law of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, that the Israel was to live by. It defined their relationship with God, the things that they were to do in order to stay in good favor with God, to obey Him and to honor Him and all that. And as God came on the mountain, it was a terrifying sight. Even Moses himself was afraid. Even though he had spoken to God, God had given him the 10 Commandments, all the law. He was face to face with God for a considerable amount of time. But even as he brings the 10 Commandments down on the mountain and the people are engaged in idolatry and God strikes many people dead, Moses himself was at that point terrified of God. But as God came down on this mountain, there was lightning and thunder and earthquake activity, and there was the sound of a loud trumpet. And the people were so afraid, as he mentions here, that they said, "Okay, Moses, you go and talk to God. We'll go over here and we'll just close our ears and we won't listen." They were so terrified at God speaking that they didn't want to hear anything about anything from God. They were happy with sending Moses to be their mediator, so that maybe he would die. They weren't happy with him anyway, so we'll kill two birds with one stone. That was a joke, by the way. If you know the rest of the story, the people of Israel really did not, they were irritated with Moses at times and often were a thorn in his side. But there was so much terror, and it was so much more terrifying because God said, "Okay, Moses is going to come up and talk to me, But if anybody else dares approach this mountain and touch it, or if these animals happen to wander off, you got to make sure you're keeping an eye on your cows. They don't get out of their pen, out of the fence. If even they touch the mountain, they're supposed to die. So it was terrifying. It was absolutely horrible. Because God's glory is terrifying. You don't see any instance in the Bible where people approach God and they're like, oh, hey, God, how's it going today? Like they are falling on their faces in fear. They are absolutely terrified. And oftentimes they want to die. And as he's describing this image of people of God meeting God at Mount Sinai, and God's presence comes down, all this fear, all this shaking, all this fire imagery, it reminds me of a volcano, like what's happening currently in Hawaii. That it is a terrifying sight. There's all these gases that are coming off. There's lava that's being shot up 300 feet up in the air, and they're talking about boulders, like 9-10 ton boulders getting shot up, and you have no idea, like 300 feet up in the air, you have no idea where those suckers are going to land. I mean, it is an absolutely terrifying sight. You want to get away as far away as you can. And that is the image of terror that is being evoked here. God's presence, His glory is so terrifying. And I hear people, and I've wanted this for myself, it would be awesome to talk to God face to face. Like, to me, my heart kind of longs for it. It kind of breaks in a way that all these people of the Old Testament in Jesus' ministry, they got to see God. They got to talk with God. They got to hear God. They got to see God lead them in a pillar of fire by day, or a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. Why can't we have any of that today? But as I reflect on the Old Testament, when they did have that, when God did encounter His people, they were afraid and they couldn't stand it. And they said, no, we don't want to look at you. So I recognize that it's probably for our own good that God doesn't reveal Himself in that way anymore. And I also recognize that people, when they did see God and they saw His glory come down in the tabernacle, or saw His presence, or saw the miracles that He did, that they still didn't believe in God. And even the people who witnessed the ministry of Jesus, they saw God in the flesh, they touched Him, they ate meals with Him, they hung out with Him, they went fishing with Him. They did all of these things with Him, and yet they didn't believe in Him. So I would like to think, well, I'd be so much better than them if I saw God. Yes, my faith would be so strong, but a lot of people didn't believe, even though they did see God in His glory. But if you notice that the author of Hebrews is telling us that we have not come to this mountain. This is not the mountain that we have come to. We have not come to this horribly terrifying place. He is trying to tell us that for those who are willing to hear, the good news of Jesus is not terrifying. It is not something that is supposed to bring fear into our hearts. It's supposed to be liberating and freeing. It is good news, not terrifying news. And I just can't help thinking in my brain, back in the day, fire and brimstone, hellfire and brimstone sermons were popular. As if you can scare people out of hell, which some people respond well to fear. But it's good news, not terrifying news. So we have not come to a mountain of fear. We have not come to Mount Zion or Mount Sinai. We've come to a greater mountain than that. And he tells us about that in verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion. In the but that he is using there, it is a very strong contrast. You have not come to this place of terror and fear, but you have come to Mount Zion, and to the holy city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to the innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn, who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, and the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So instead of coming to this place of terrifying fear of Mount Sinai, he says that we have come to Zion. Zion was a particular mountain in Jerusalem that when the people of Israel came in to inhabit the land, inherit the land, conquer all the people that were there, when they did that and they established, God said, I want to be in Jerusalem, and they set up the tabernacle to be in Jerusalem, and they put it on this particular peak called Mount Zion. It's a place that God chose to be with his people. But he says we haven't come to this physical Zion. He is using this as a metaphor to talk about the closeness that we have now with God. We have come to this great close relationship with God. We are no longer his enemies. We are no longer people who experience his wrath. We have come to a place of joy. And he tells us this is the heavenly Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. And as he is describing the scene, it is Zion is a place of joyful celebration. And as we come to Zion, we're not just coming to Zion itself. Oh, look at that mountain. That's a tall mountain. There's all sorts of awesome things that we are coming to as well. There's these angels who are also rejoicing. I mean, awesome. We get to hang out with angels. And he also talks about there are followers of Jesus who have passed from this life and they're with God in heaven. And he says that we have come to God himself. And we don't need a veil. We don't need to hide. We don't need to cower in fear. And then he talks about those who have the spirits of those who have accepted Christ. That they're not with God in heaven fully yet, but they are still with God. And that is those of us who are still alive. And he talks about also we have come to Jesus himself, who has given us a greater and more awesome covenant than what they had in the Old Testament. That Jesus has given us a new law, a new way of life that is so much more awesome and freeing than what they had in the past. This is a place of joy. This is a place of celebration, a place where we get to see and be with God without having to fear him so much. And this is a party or a celebration image. When you look at the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, we see that there's this wedding feast of the Lamb. This is a celebration that we get to have with God. So think about the best party or celebration that you've had. Maybe it was a birthday or graduation, or maybe a retirement party for some of y'all who are so retiree. I don't want to say you're old, but many of you are past that stage. But at those parties, those celebrations, there's food and there's these conversations, and you're telling the stories, and you talk about the practical jokes that you played on people. You talk about all those good times, and it is fun. It is a celebration. Yes, there are some tears and there's some crying, especially. I mean, Jennifer will tell us about this in a couple weeks when Curtis is all graduated and she's crying and all that kind of stuff. We'll make fun of her still. But it's a time of joy and celebration, these milestones that we have in life. And that's what it is when we come to Christ. It is a joyful thing. It is a celebration that we have with Jesus. It's such a great celebration because we have been granted access to God without having to follow all those rituals, all those things that they had to do in the Old Testament. We have been forgiven by the blood of Christ. And he compares here the blood of Jesus with the blood of Abel, which is kind of like this maybe a seemingly obscure reference. But if you remember back in the Old Testament, Cain and Abel were brothers. Cain killed Abel, and God's like, Cain, what happened to your brother? I don't know. My brother's keeper. I don't know where my brother is. And then God said, well, your brother's blood is speaking to me from the earth. I know you killed your brother, you idiot. So Abel's blood was proclaiming a message of condemnation, a message of guilt. But Jesus' blood proclaims a message of forgiveness, a totally different message. So instead of being terrified of God's wrath, we now rejoice. Because we have been given this salvation, because we can draw near to him, because when we accept his forgiveness of our sins, he comes and we become a temple of the Holy Spirit. God is with us. And not only that, but we have a community, we have a family that extends beyond our immediate family, extends beyond the boundaries of our county. It extends even beyond all nations in time. It extends into heaven, where those who have gone before us are with God. So there's many reasons to celebrate and have joy. So as we can see that we ought to be, even though we ought to be fearful of God, we need to be leaning in the joy and the celebration side of things. We need to focus more on Mount Zion and less on Mount Sinai. But as we entertain both reactions to God, there is a warning that he gives us here in verses 25 through 27 when he says, "See that you do not refuse him who is speaking." Don't ignore Jesus. Don't ignore God as he is speaking to you. For if they, meaning the people of the Old Testament, did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. So God spoke through Moses. Moses said, if you walk away from God, God's going to smack you. He's going to wipe you out. And then that's happened. So if he says, if Moses said those warnings and God punished his people, we ought to be a little bit more afraid of a lot more afraid of Jesus when he warns us from heaven. And at that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. And here he's quoting from Haggai chapter 2. When he's giving a word of encouragement to his people, as they're trying to rebuild after they are coming back from exile. They're trying to rebuild Jerusalem, but they have all these enemies around them that are persecuting them, that are giving them a hard time, that God says he's going to shake them, he's going to level them, he's going to wipe them out, and he's going to restore his people. And he's mentioning that here because as he is giving the sermon to these people, they were experiencing persecution. They had enemies who were trying to persecute them and kill them and give them a hard time because they are following Jesus. So he's using this as a way of encouraging them. But he says, this phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful. Well, I'll stop there. So he's given us this image of things that are being shaken. Think of an earthquake. Things that are well built are going to stay if they have a good foundation, good construction, good materials. When that earthquake shakes, the good things are going to remain and the bad things are going to go away. Or in their context, this probably evokes also an image of when you're harvesting grain. You shake the grain and you let the chaff blow away, and you're left with the good stuff. And the chaff is then taken, gathered, and thrown in a fire. So it's an image of, again, also judgments. But the idea is that God is going to shake the heavens and the earth. He's going to bring judgment. He's going to bring wrath on this earth. He's going to take and wipe the slate clean in the heavens and the earth, and he's going to make a new heavens and a new earth. But those things that are of good quality and have a strong foundation are going to remain. And so he's given us this warning to us that we need to be faithful to Jesus. We need to stay connected with him and not wander away and not face his wrath. That we need to make sure that we are walking in a good way and honoring him with our lives. And this is a message that is consistent throughout this letter or this sermon to the Hebrews, that over and over again God says, stay close to me, don't wander away. If we believe in God, we accept his forgiveness, and we faithfully follow him, we know that we have a good foundation. We know that we have good building materials. But those who don't are going to find out that they are not going to last. So he says, make sure you don't ignore Jesus. The stakes are way too high. And the image, again here, as I mentioned, it makes me think of an earthquake. When I was a little kid, I remember in 1994, I had to look up the date, there was an earthquake in California. that shook Los Angeles. And I just remember these pictures of their overpasses where there were cars that were stuck on one section, and there was a piece that had fallen down this way or a piece that had fallen down this way. And so cars were stranded on these overpasses. Or there were gas lines that had ruptured in the roads, and there were fires and explosions and all sorts of stuff because they didn't really know any better. They built things because of the modern age, and they didn't really know to take into account all these earthquakes and how to build skyscrapers and bridges accordingly. So they learned a lot after that. And that is the image that we have if we don't stay faithful to Jesus. So if we don't accept Christ, that when Jesus comes to judge, that we are not going to last. So again, there's this joy, but there's also a warning to make sure things are going to line up right. But then he goes on in verse 28 and says, therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship and reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. So he makes this comparison between the things of the earth and Jesus' kingdom. When everything is all said and done, when everything shakes out, Jesus' kingdom is going to last forever. It is unstoppable. It is undefeatable. There's no way that Jesus' kingdom is ever going to end. But by contrast, the kingdoms of the earth will end. The nations will rise and fall. Rome rose to great prominence, and it eventually fell. America one day will somehow cease to be America, and that is a scary thought, but Jesus' kingdom will never end. Natural disasters will come, and they will wipe away things that we have built. We have worked so hard to build. The universe itself will be done away with and be remade. But Jesus' kingdom will remain forever. But we are a part of that kingdom, which means if we are a part of that kingdom, that we too will not be overcome. We too will endure for all of eternity. And because of that, because we are a part of Jesus' kingdom, we ought to give thanks. Belonging to his kingdom compels us to give thanks, that we don't take it for granted, that we are thankful to him, that no matter what we are going through in our lives, even though everything might be falling apart, Jesus will never fail. We can be thankful that no matter what we have to endure as followers of Christ, no matter how severe the persecution might get, Jesus will never fail. But thankfulness isn't just an attitude of gratitude, which is a good way to start, but he also says that our thankfulness then moves us to worship God. Give God acceptable worship. Which doesn't mean that you rock out to Chris Tomlin songs every second of the day, or Matt Redman, or you don't sing songs, or you don't worship God in music 24 hours a day. But worshiping God, giving him acceptable worship, is giving him our entire lives. This reminds me of Romans chapter 12, verse 1, where we are to consider ourselves as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. That is our spiritual act of worship, giving God everything that we have and everything that we are. Not just about coming here and singing for a few minutes on a Sunday morning, but we give God our entire lives. And then he wraps up that section with this the statement that we ought to have fear and reverence for God because he is a consuming fire. Which again, we have joy, but then we have awe and fear. But again, it's a warning to don't wander away. Don't wander away from God so that you are not consumed by his fire. But also, for those who are experiencing persecution or hard times or having people rise up against them because they're following Christ, it is a promise that God will judge them. That God will do away with the wicked. He will do away with those who persecute his people unless they turn to Jesus. So yes, it is a warning, it is a fear that we don't walk away from God, but it is also a promise that God will bring justice to those who are facing persecution for their faith. So in light of all the things that this preacher gives to us this morning, there are two things that really stand out to me. The first one is that we need to be joyful. That being a follower of Christ is a thing that gives us joy. We have joy because of what Jesus has done for us and what he continues to do. We have joy because of our future life with Christ for eternity. But we also need to be thankful. Thankful that we don't have to endure his wrath. Thankful for the blessings that he gives to us each and every day. Thankful for the strength that he gives us in the midst of trouble. So there are a lot of terrifying things that we're going to face in this life. We're going to face opposition. Some will face persecution. Terrifying and terrible things. But as we faithfully follow Jesus in this life, we don't have to worry about God's wrath. His wrath is not on the list of things for us to fear. Because we have not come to Mount Sinai, we have come to Mount Zion, where there is great joy and celebration. So this morning, draw near to God with joy, with gratitude, because we have a lot to celebrate.